about these events. On Sunday the 16th, we have yoga at the Dalí in our Raymond James Community Room. On the 18th at 6 p.m., we have a workshop, Surreal Pet Portrait Painting. And I know many of you love your pets, so definitely go online and sign up for that. Tickets are still available. On the 20th at 5 p.m., we have our amazing party night, our Surreal Summer Nights, which this is the last Surreal Summer Nights. But it is not the last of our surreal partying. But join us for that. It is a free event on the first floor, and we will have a special cocktail from Cafe Gala. Also, select nights and days, we will have the showing nights and days, so during the day and at the night, Surreal Nature in the Dome. If you have not seen Surreal Nature in our 360 Dome experience, please check it out. If you love surreal images, you like dreamlike animals, rain, lights, all the things, come check it out. And how could I not mention Sueños at the Dalí? Raise your hand if you've been. Put you on the spot. Okay, so we have about a half to a third of the room. Please join us for our October 24th, 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. Sueños at the Dalí. The theme is the surreal jewelry box. And I have a one-liner I'm supposed to read. Join us for a dazzling soiree of surreal glamour. So join us for that. For our next Coffee with the Curator in September, we have Christiana Gaudet, and she will be discussing tarot cards, art history, mystery, and culture. So please sign up on our website, the same as you did for today, so you can secure your spot for our tarot card special. And we also sell our Dalí tarot cards in our store if you're interested. Now, please welcome the Dalí's Director of Curatorial Affairs, Dr. Jennifer Cohen, to introduce our speaker of the morning, Dr. Elliot King.
Thank you, Joy, and good morning to everyone. Welcome to the Dalí Museum. A special welcome before we begin. Elliott's wife, Emily, and their twins, Vivian and Lillian, are visiting St. Petersburg this week and are here with us in the audience. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to seeing all the wonderful things you do. This morning's speaker, Elliot King, is professor of art history and chair of the Department of Art and Art History at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. He trained at the Courtauld Institute and took his doctorate at the University of Essex. But he has been dedicated to Dalí studies since his undergraduate days at the University of Denver, where he wrote his thesis on a period of Dalí's work that had not yet received much attention, but in which our collection has a great strength, late Dalí. An ambitious undergraduate, he traveled here to St. Petersburg to do primary research at our former building. And as our curator and senior interpreter, Peter Tush, remembers it, he arrived with his characteristic panache. A certain aspect of the dandy about him, Oscar Wilde or Dorian Gray. He met our founders, Eleanor and Reynolds Morse, and that undergraduate thesis grew. And it grew into his doctoral dissertation, The Tragic Myth of the Two Dalís. He's been taking that myth apart ever since, the notion that there is a serious Dalí on one hand and a spectacular one on the other, and that we must choose. Anyone who knows our collection knows that this museum does not accept that choice either. Peter was pleased, though I suspect not surprised, to watch that ambitious undergraduate become a dedicated scholar of Dalí, and dare I say, the foremost. So it was fitting that roughly a decade after that first visit, the two of them were working together again, training the docents at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta for the exhibition Elliott curated there, Dalí, The Late Work, the show that made the American case for the second half of this artist's career. Elliott has published widely, including Dalí, Surrealism and Cinema, and Radical Dreams, Surrealism, Counterculture, and Resistance. And his essays appear in the catalogs of the Centre Pompidou, the Reina Sofia, Tate Modern, and the Museum of Modern Art, as well as this museum's own journal. He has curated Dalí across the globe, and he is a founding member of the International Society for Surrealism, or the Study of Surrealism, many S's in that title, and now serves as its president. It's hard to overestimate what Elliott has done for Dalí's studies. He is this museum's scholarly counterpart, truly, the main voice of Dalí scholarship in the United States, taking on the legacy of Dalí in the archive, in the classroom, and in print. Together, I would venture to say, this institution and this scholar have defined the reception of Dalí in the English language. And I continue to be encouraged and fascinated by the way that he keeps developing this work. What I admire most is Elliott's temperament as a scholar. He proceeds like a detective, privileging the question and the pursuit of new knowledge above hagiography, above a certain persistent thread of Dalínian deification. Consider his new scholarship on Dalí's tarot, titled The Magician's Cards Tricks. What made that research new was not primarily the conclusions he reached, but those he questioned and pursued doggedly for proof. Where proof ran out, he instead went to a living witness, Amanda Lear, Dalí's muse and closest friend of nearly 20 years, and reported her firsthand assertions for the record. This fidelity to scholarly accuracy is the counterpart of our own daily relationship with the objects in our care. This morning, the detective takes a new case. Dalí's dream sequence for Alfred Hitchcock's Spellbound, presented in conjunction with our special exhibition, Dalí in America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elliot King.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jen. I should stop now, actually. That was so lovely. It's only going to go downhill from here, y'all. But that was so nice. Thank you. So it's great to be back in St. Pete. It's as Jen said, I've been coming here for a very long time. It's been wonderful to see the museum grow and to meet and see so many friends here that I've known for a very long time. So thank you all for coming. Thanks to those who are streaming online or who will see this at some point in YouTube. I want to begin by thanking Kim McQuarrie and Joy Garrett, Peter Tush for organizing and inviting my stay here. Jen, of course, for supervising this as well. Sophia Harris, who did just some wonderful work in the archives for me. Hank Hine, who has always been a great supporter of my work. So thank you all very, very, very much. I first began, I first published on Alfred Hitchcock's 1945 movie Spellbound nearly 20 years ago. And I've returned to this subject several times over the years, though this occasion has actually prompted me to revise some of those earlier dates and conclusions. So what I'm going to be presenting to you is actually very fresh new work. And when I say fresh, I mean things that I discovered last week. So things are very, very clear. Happily, my larger arguments have remained consistent, so that's always good. But the chronology has actually become both clearer and a little bit more questionable, which I suppose is a sort of thing that happens when you go back to an archive. Things that you thought were pretty well settled aren't as settled as you think, and new questions more or less arise. I'm going to start things off by showing you the film's famous dream sequence. It's about 3 minutes long, and I probably don't need to tell you who designed it, although that's actually the topic we're going to be headed into today. Let me briefly set up the clip if you've not seen all of Spellbound, and just to warn you, there are spoilers, but it's a movie you should see nonetheless. Gregory Peck plays John Ballantyne, who's known through most of the film by his initials JB, and he arrives at Green Manor Psychiatric Hospital under the identity of Dr. Anthony Edwards. It soon emerges, however, that JB has amnesia, and he has actually taken the place of Dr. Edwards, who has been murdered. JB has assumed his identity, and he doesn't really know why, and therefore begins to suspect that he himself may have been the killer. Enter Dr. Constance Peterson, played by Ingrid Bergman, and Constance is convinced of JB's innocence, and so with the help of her colleague Alexander Bruloff, she attempts to reconstruct the crime by interpreting one of JB's dreams. The dream sequence comes about 3/4 of a way through the film, and it ultimately provides all of the clues that end up solving the mystery. So I know many of you have seen this clip before, but as you watch, I want you to consider just one question. Which of these dream elements do you think Salvador Dalí actually came up with? So here we go.
I can't make out just what sort of a place it was. be a gambling house. But there weren't any walls, just a lot of curtains with eyes painted on them. A man was walking around with a large pair of scissors cutting all the drapes in half. And then a girl came in with hardly anything on and started walking around the gambling room kissing everybody. She came to my table first.
Did you recognize this kissing bug?
I'm afraid she looked a little like Constance.
This is plain, ordinary, wishful dreaming. Go on.
I was sitting there playing cards with a man who had a beard. I was dealing to him, and I turned up a 7 of clubs. He said, "That makes 21. I win." When he turned up his cards, they were blank. Just then, the proprietor came in and accused him of cheating. The proprietor yelled, "This is my place, and if I catch you cheating again, I'll fix you." I'm sorry about that kissing bug.
I'm glad you didn't dream of me as an egg beater, as one of my patients did.
Why, what would that mean?
Never mind.
Well, does it make any sense to you what I dreamed?
Not yet. You were trying to tell yourself something. What it is, we'll figure out later.
There's a lot more to it.
Go on and try to recall the details.
The more cockeyed, the better for the scientific side of it.
He was leaning over the sloping roof of a high building. It was the man with the beard. I yelled at him to watch out. Then he went over, slowly, with his feet in the air. And then I saw the proprietor again, the man in the mask. He was hiding behind a tall chimney, and he had a small wheel in his hand. I saw him drop the wheel on the roof. Suddenly, I was running. Then I heard something beating over my head. It was a great pair of wings. The wings chased me and almost caught up with me when I came to the bottom of the hill.
Okay, plain, ordinary, wishful dreaming we've experienced here of Ingrid Bergman, not as an egg beater, which is reassuring. The interpretation that follows is fairly comically literal. The masked man is the killer. I'm sorry, there are spoilers here. The masked man is the killer. The pair of wings is identified as Gabriel Valley, which is where the murder took place. So we're very specific on that. And the wheel is a revolver that was dropped into the snow. I'm going to return to that sort of pseudo-Freudian interpretation here in a minute. But the principal question I want to ask is, what did Dalí actually contribute to this sequence when he was brought aboard? Today, when one reads about Spellbound, the general consensus is that it is a dream sequence designed by Salvador Dalí. But that's not actually what the film credits say. The film credit says that it's based on designs by Salvador Dalí, which is a small but telling difference. It changes authorship because designed by suggests something that is singular and complete, where based on designs by implies that Dalí's work is part of a chain or one stage within a larger process. I think that change actually masks what could be a much more interesting history. So when I started reconstructing the chronology through records preserved at the Selznick archives, David O. Selznick was the producer. His papers are preserved at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Something became actually increasingly clear. Dalí was never commissioned to invent the dream sequence from scratch. Most of the essential elements were already well in place before he officially joined the project in August. Now, to be fair, I'm not the first person to recognize that much of the script was in place prior to Dalí's arrival. Sarah Cochran observed back in 2007 that the screenplay largely predated Dalí's involvement, basing her research too on documents in the Selznick files. The real question for me, though, was when did these elements enter the script, and how familiar were the writers with Dalí's work? The scenes, after all, I think we can agree, look very Dalinian. Through the Selznick files, I was able to trace most of the script's dream sequences to around the same time that Dalí was brought aboard, or at least being talked about, which was mid-June of 1944. Serendipitously, however, I found another, I'm sorry, that was mid-July of 1944. Serendipitously, I found an earlier script dated from June 1944 that had been previously uncatalogued and was in a private collection. And it gave some really interesting dates about the screenplay. You can see that it's from June 44, so about a month earlier than the earliest known script that we had. What it shows is that the gambling hall with the curtains covered with eyes, the masked proprietor, the rooftop plunge, and JB running to escape a pair of wings were all actually in the script before Dalí was brought aboard, which is kind of curious, right? It's significant because this is, again, about a month before Dalí's name is even tossed around in the studio to say, we might hire Salvador Dalí, and about a month and a half before Dalí signed his contract. So a lot of those elements that we think of them are being very Dalí-esque actually were already in the script, and that's actually very strange. I don't want to suggest that he had nothing to do with the script. That would be really overreaching, and I think he had a substantial to do with what we see. But I do want to correct a few lingering missteps in the chronology and think about how the script development changes, how we understand the relationship with Freud, how we understand it with Dalí, and what he really had to do with making this famous dream sequence based on his designs. So I know that's a lot for a morning coffee. Hopefully we got a lot of coffee before we entered in. But let's turn into the production itself and think about how much Dalí really loved Hollywood. Dalí enjoyed Hollywood movies a lot. He loved the old comedies of Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton. Back in 1937, he had written enthusiastically to André Breton in Paris that he was in Hollywood and he had met the three great surrealists, Harpo Marx, Walt Disney, and Cecil B. DeMille. And he began trying to apply his ideas to Hollywood films. He wrote a very famous script with the Marx Brothers, which I mentioned only in passing, titled Giraffes on Horseback Salad. This is a picture of Dalí drawing Harpo Marx while he's playing a harp with barbed wire strings that Dalí had given him as a gift for Christmas. Unfortunately, the script was panned mostly by Groucho, apparently, who said that it was too surrealist, and so the Marx Brothers weren't interested in following up. Another opportunity had come in 1941 when 20th Century Fox hired him to devise a short nightmare sequence for the film Moontide. But when Archie Mayo replaced Fritz Lang as the director, Dalí's sequence was eliminated. So by the time Hitchcock approached him in 1944, Spellbound represented Dalí's third significant attempt to bring his ideas to the American screen. And he really, really wanted this venture to work out. So we've seen the finished dream sequence now, which is what most people know, what's showing in the gallery now, in Peter's really wonderful show, Dalí in America. But to understand Dalí's full role, I think we need to step back and think of some earlier treatments of the script. So I'm going to give you several dates, and I know this is sort of intense, but these dates are really important for thinking about the chronology. On June 14th, the screenplay, what I just alluded to, contained pretty much the entire narrative framework of the finished dream, including those eyeball curtains, scissors, the gambling room, a ballroom sequence, a statue transformation, I'll talk a little bit about that, the rooftop fall, and the downhill pursuit. Just a few days later, David O. Selznick responded to an estimate, placing that anticipated dream sequence at about $150,000, and he threw a fit, saying that this should absolutely not go forward. And it wasn't until July 6th that his memos begin alluding to possibly bringing in an unnamed celebrated artist onto the production. Finally, mid-July, Selznick says, well, maybe Dalí would be a good person to bring aboard this, but only for the publicity value, because we basically have everything already in place. And then the contract was sent to him, to Dalí, on August 2nd, commissioning him to make rough preliminary sketches interpreting 4 episodes of the dream. So you can see by this language that I'm trying to be careful with how I phrase this, that Dalí was commissioned to make sketches interpreting the dream. He wasn't commissioned to make a dream sequence or tabula rasa. So a word of caution about the archive, I should say. Selznick kept meticulous records. We have a lot in the archive, but some working scripts were amended, others were missing altogether. Private conversations, of course, don't have a paper trail. So we don't really know when Dalí's name came up or what was happening around June 14th. But what I can say is that as of mid-July, the studio was still just investigating whether or not to bring Dalí aboard, which is actually why I find this June 14th script really exciting. So let me go back to earlier scripts. Spellbound's storyline is based very loosely on the 1927 novel The House of Dr. Edouard by Hilary Saunders and John Palmer, writing under the pseudonym Francis Beating. It's the story of a homicidal maniac who assumes the position of the director of a mental institution. Light reading. And Hitchcock found that to be good fodder for a film. And so in 1943, he presented a filmic adaptation to David O. Selznick, with whom he had previously worked on the film Rebecca. Hitchcock developed the earliest treatments with his friend Angus MacPhail. But by February of 1944, when this script is written, the story had changed dramatically. Edwards was no longer a murderer, a maniac, but now he was an amnesiac. And the script promised a love affair between Edwards and another psychiatrist, then named Constance Sedgwick. So you're thinking about Constance, her name changed as well. MacPhail's script refers explicitly to Freud's 1899 interpretation of dreams, though importantly for our purposes here, there's no dream sequence. They relied instead on childhood flashbacks that would gradually restore Edwards' memory. By the time Selznick brought Academy Award-winning screenwriter Ben Hecht onto the project then in March of 1944, a dream was becoming part of the storyline. But there was still no dream sequence. J.B. simply recounted having had a dream, and Constance and Bruloff would try to interpret that. But Hecht really elaborated on the dream's importance. In one of the script's more bizarre treatments, dated April 3rd of 1944, J.B. describes fighting with a brownie in a green suit. To quote, "A little man about 2 feet high with a painted head, a big stomach, and spindly legs. It wasn't a dwarf, it was a brownie." How weird the dream sequence would have been if this had gone through. The battle takes place during a Japanese play titled Nukna, and the painted scenery, 2 cloudy skies, fall on top of them during the battle. The interpretation of this version was also pretty one-dimensional. It turns out in this script that falling skies mean falling skis, and the brownie refers to a brownie camera that Edwards had and dropped at the scene. Nukna is a misdirection for the title of the 1922 film Nanook of the North, just to remind us that the murder took place at a ski resort. So as awkward as these interpretations will seem to us today, the Production Code Administrative Council actually censored Hecht's early scripts for being too Freudian. Censors objected to such dangerous words as sex menace, libido, frustration, and perhaps my favorite, tomcat. These restrictions made anything resembling authentic Freudian dream work rather difficult because Hollywood wanted Freud, but without the libido, frustration, or tomcats. The June 14th screenplay, however, reveals that this simplification didn't happen all at once. At this stage, the dream actually retains some traces of more genuinely psychoanalytic structures, one that had carried over from MacPhail's earliest treatments. The dream begins, as in the finished sequence, with the gambling hall, which is decorated with curtains, eyes painted on them. Figure enters with scissors, begins cutting them in half. But J.B. is described as playing cards with a man with a beard. And in this version, the bearded man is explicitly identified by Bruloff as a paternal image. For those who have seen the film, this is significant because J.B.'s psychological condition is the result not only of the death of Dr. Edwards, but also of a childhood memory, a trauma of accidentally killing his own brother. The dream therefore figures much more prominently in this version of the script and creates more of a sense of paternal judgment associated with J.B.'s childhood guilt. In short, it's much closer to an authentic Freudian interpretation than what we get in the finished sequence. The June 14th script also describes scenes that would figure into later versions of the script. There is a ballroom sequence where J.B. dances with Constance. Other dancers are dressed in white, with an orchestra in white fur hats positioned in the corner, led by Dr. Bruloff. This is all part of the dream. And they perform Jean Sibelius's piece, Valse Triste, Sad Waltz. This then is followed by a scene of Constance transforming into an eyeless statue. She sprouts wings and pursues JB down the enormous ramp representing the ski slope and that part, of course, survives in the finished film. One can imagine some particularly rich Freudian interpretations of these scenarios, but I'm not going to try to make such analyses. My point is that in mid-June, the shooting script contained a network of visual and psychological associations involving vision, blindness, memory, trauma, paternal authority, and within weeks, much of that material had disappeared. By mid-July, the bearded man's resemblance to JB's father was no longer there. The statue was no longer described as eyeless. And the music had turned from Sibelius to Rimsky-Korsakov's The Snow Maiden, again making it more explicit about the murder taking place in the snow. Every symbol ultimately had to have some nice, tidy answer. This is a pity because the paternal guilt authority narrative would have been particularly apt for Salvador Dalí, because it appears in many of his paintings from the 1930s, 1920s, paired with complexes of Oedipal struggle, his relationship with his father, ideas of sexuality. Dalí would have eaten that script up. But unfortunately, he would have never seen it. Because I hasten to remind us that at this point, there was no sort of suggestion they even thought about having Dalí involved. And this makes the first major memo in our chronology, dated June 21st, particularly interesting. It responds to that report that the proposed sequence is going to cost about $150,000, which is over $2 million today. Selznick calls this sum a ghastly shock and freezes all further work until he's personally investigated the situation. It's at this point that some confusion has arisen over Dalí's role in all of this. Several historians over the years, including myself, candidly, have treated the $150,000 estimate as potential evidence of Dalí's grandiose and ultimately unrealized plans. Ingrid Bergman helped fuel that legend in 1975 when she told an interviewer that Dalí's sequence had originally lasted over 20 minutes long. Perhaps, we imagine, Bergman was right, and Dalí had conceived a 20-minute dream sequence, the sort of oniric extravaganza, and the ghastly sum reflected the outsized scale of his imagination. The dream sequence was certainly shortened. James Bigwood has done really wonderful research about that, but the surviving script records do not support nearly such a dramatic contraction. And what the June 14th script makes clear is that all of the designs that are being talked about right now didn't come from Dalí. Plans were well underway to visualize the dream sequence, but that $150,000 figure seems to have come out of elaborate studio-generated scenarios containing a range of effects that would have been very expensive to stage at that time. Indeed, it would still be another 2 weeks before Selznick even hints at bringing an unnamed celebrity artist onto the production, and Dalí's name doesn't appear again, as I said, until mid-July. And even then, it's still just being investigated. In short, there's no archival basis for treating the $150,000 estimate as evidence of Dalí's demands. And whatever produced that enormous figure emerged from the studio, not from Dalí's participation. So that addresses one part of the chronology that's already been pretty confusing. So what do we know about Dalí's direct involvement with the film? Well, as you see, it seems that Selznick was entertaining the notion of bringing him aboard in early July. And again, his name appears in the surviving correspondence only after July 18th. At that point, Selznick writes that the studio is confidentially considering engaging Dalí, though it would only be worth it for the publicity. He makes private inquiries with Life and Look magazine, asking what sort of publicity could be expected, and receives surprising little enthusiasm. Dalí had already appeared in Life magazine 6 times during the previous year and risked overexposure. Then there was the question of his salacious work. As one member of the production team put it, Ingrid Bergman might be too strong a contrast with Dalí's, quote, phallic frescoes. As late as July 25th, Selznick insisted that no agreement with Dalí should be made if the sequence was likely to cost more than $30,000. The following day, a memo was circulated that the studio did not intend to employ Dalí, and that as soon as Hitchcock agreed, the sequence could simply be handed over to art director James Basovy. Hitchcock, however, was determined. He later shared that publicity was never his primary motivation. 5 years older than Dalí, Hitchcock belonged to the same generation that had come of age alongside 20th century modernism. He shared Dalí's long-standing interest in Freudian psychoanalysis. And for Hitchcock, Dalí's paintings were uniquely capturing the vividness of dreams. He later explained that the artist's very solid and very sharp imagery offered a compelling alternative to the cinematic cliché of the blurred dream. He added, quote, "I could have taken de Curator or Ernst, but no one was as imaginative and extravagant as Dalí." Selznick's eventual change of heart is not documented in his files, but on August 2nd, Dalí's movie agent, Felix Ferry, sent Selznick a telegram reporting a constructive meeting between Dalí, Hitchcock, and the studio's artistic team. Daniel Shea, the studio's vice president, negotiated Dalí down from a $5,000 fee to a $4,000 fee, paid in exchange for rough preliminary sketches, providing the interpretation of 4 episodes in the dream sequence: the gambling hall, the rooftop, the ballroom, and the downhill chase. The contract was dated August 2nd, but negotiations continued through August 18th, about 12 days before filming of the sequence was actually scheduled to begin. So with the script now in place, Dalí aboard, what's going to happen in August? To be sure, he does not have creative carte blanche. The dream was central to the film's plot, and if he departed too far from the narrative, the sequence would no longer perform its necessary function in solving the murder. Now, we might respond that Spellbound was a film and therefore it needed a script, which is pragmatic enough. But contrast this with his previous work for Moontide. Asked to devise a 3-minute nightmare sequence reflecting the protagonist's fears that he may have committed a murder during a drunken binge, Dalí submitted 2 original scenarios to 20th Century Fox. This is 1941. They included shark-headed women, giant sewing machines, flaming giraffes, and a Japanese man transforming into a camel. None of this was ultimately used, but the commission gave Dalí extraordinary imaginative freedom. Spellbound was quite different. Here, the dream was central to the plot, and he could elaborate on the visual world, but he couldn't simply throw in some flaming giraffes that weren't in the script. He had to visually interpret the scenes that came from the studio. Still, while the narrative role of the images was largely fixed, their visual form was not, and this is really where Dalí shines. Indeed, looking at the finished film, he got the call that it needs to be a curtain with eyeballs painted on it. But much of that imagery that he actually created appears in the surviving script, actually more than the studio's own hand-wringing might suggest. The gambling hall curtain, for example, survives, as we see. Also, tables with mannequin legs appear in Dalí's early sketches, and each table had 4 metronomes with eyes attached to their swinging pendulums. All of that is included in the finished film. Looking at this drawing here, you can see a little eyeball in the table. He also wanted cockroaches in the gambling hall, each with a tiny eye glued to its back to match the eyeball's motif. No memos surfaced about why these cockroaches were cut, but I really would have loved to have been a fly on the wall during that meeting, just to find out why they were not going to include the cockroaches in the storyline. Another Dalí invention that survives in the film is this enigmatic pair of pincer pliers looming in the background of the running scene. The pliers caused particular concern with the film's psychiatric advisor, Dr. May Rom. Rom was Selznick's own psychiatrist and was paid $1,500 to advise on the film's psychoanalytic accuracy. Rom protested the pliers were of enormous and conspicuous irrelevance and should be cut from the picture. She wrote Selznick saying that any patients speaking to their analyst would surely have mentioned dreaming of such an unusual object, and any competent analyst would clearly identify it as phallic. This oversight alone, she wrote, could cost the film its hoped-for endorsement from the psychiatric community. The episode really encapsulates the film's paradox. Spellbound wanted the appearance of psychoanalysis, but not symbols capable of generating any uniquely unruly psychoanalytic meaning. Rom was also concerned about Hecht's elaborate ballroom sequence. Dalí suggested moving Hecht's musicians overhead and proposed suspending large sculpted pianos above the dancers to create an oppressive sense of weight. He also suspended coal sacks from the ceiling in homage to Marcel Duchamp's installation of coal sacks in the 1938 International Surrealist Exhibition in Paris. Of all these unusual visuals, Dr. Rom was most concerned by the simple act of dancing, which she opined could be interpreted as a Freudian symbol of sexual intercourse. She meanwhile concluded that the coal sacks contributed nothing to the narrative, but however strange, also did not interfere with it, so she wasn't worried about the coal sacks. On September 13th, after 2 weeks of production, Selznick received word that Hitchcock was satisfied with Dalí's efforts and arrangements should be made to pay his fee. Dalí and Gala departed for Pebble Beach, while Hitchcock left Los Angeles for New York. However, Dalí remained dissatisfied with the ballroom sequence and offered to reshoot it if Hitchcock were amenable. However, the studio faced other more pressing concerns. They were really working a lot on that transformation of Ingrid Bergman into a Grecian statue, which actually ended up having to be reshot twice. This would have been a wonderful part of the film if it had survived, and while the film footage of this famous episode is known to have happened, we have photographs of it, we haven't found any actual film of this particular episode. According to Bergman, Hitchcock filmed her breaking out of a plaster body cast, and that footage was going to be screened in reverse to make it appear that her body was turning into stone. The crew shot multiple takes, made lots of plaster casts, only to later discover that the entire time the camera shutter had been closed during filming. So nothing had been recorded. The difficult scene was staged again in late September, only days before the film's first test screening in Pasadena. I'll just mention aside that Dalí also wanted to have Ingrid Bergman covered with ants in this scene, but that idea was rejected right off because one does not put ants on Ingrid Bergman. The film, still titled House of Dr. Edwards, received a generally enthusiastic response at the first screening, though the studio sent a hefty list of revisions. The gambling hall scene needed to be reshot. The ballroom sequence needed to be cut. New dialogue was added to bridge the resulting jump to the statue sequence, and the title changed. Hitchcock preferred The House of Dr. Edwards. Selznick liked Spellbound, which is, of course, what stuck. Even with these modifications, however, Selznick was deeply disappointed. He insisted that Dalí's designs were not the problem. The more he looked at it, he said he disliked the photography, the lighting, the entire visual execution, which he compared unfavorably to the work of a low-budget studio. Selznick said that he wanted what he called a whole new shake on the sequence. And for that, he turned to William Cameron Menzies, the celebrated production designer with whom he had worked on Gone with the Wind. Now, Menzies' intervention has long been recognized in the scholarship, and the clearest way to describe it is that Dalí created many of the things we see, and Menzies determined how we see them. By November 27th, Menzies had created a new storyboard that matches virtually shot for shot what became the finished dream sequence. Dalí's paintings remained in use, mostly as backdrops. Selznick forwarded Menzies' new plan of sketches to Dalí and Hitchcock, though there's no record in the Selznick archive of either's reply. During December, Menzies' team reshot the eye curtain, the card game, and the rooftop scenes, the latter using puppets against Dalí's backdrop, and Dalí panicked. He learned that the material was being reworked and offered further participation at no extra charge. But Selznick warned that any amendments at this point would have to arrive immediately, and Menzies completed the remaining reshoots in January of 1945. So just to recap, thinking about what we saw in that dream sequence, the curtain, the card game, and the rooftop scene were all reshot after both Dalí and Hitchcock were offset. Despite this major role in crafting the film, Menzies refused to take any credit. Selznick wrote that he was not surprised, saying, "Whatever reasons Bill may have for not wanting credit, as far as I am concerned, the sequence is a severe disappointment." The new dream sequence was previewed as part of the film on February 16th, 1945, in Huntington Park, California, but still work continued over the next 7 months under art director James Bassavy, who ultimately received the film's production design credit. As production drew to a close, a series of fairly fascinating memoranda reveals Selznick's growing apprehension about how to credit Dalí after so many alterations. His legal counsel, Robert Dan, advised Selznick that there was really no need to show the completed sequence to Dalí or his representatives, and that it would probably be a mistake to do so. The credit, initially phrased per Dalí's contract as dream sequence designed by Salvador Dalí, was revised to dream sequence based on designs by Salvador Dalí. And as Dan said, the artist may be upset, but he probably won't squawk. These two words, I think, are doing an enormous amount of work here. That revised credit acknowledges that the sequence had passed through many hands, and it points towards a deeper contradiction in the collaboration between Dalí and Hollywood, that so-called dream factory. At first glance, Dalí and Hollywood seems like it might be perfectly suited to one another. But to make the plot work in Spellbound, each image had to eventually lose its ambiguity and settle into a fixed explanation. Wings became Gabriel Valley, the blank cards became the 21 Club. Everything was really fixed. But Dalí's most compelling inventions, enormous pliers, suspended pianos, resist that kind of easy closure. They invite uncertainty. Perhaps this is why when asked later about his contribution, Dalí was blunt. He said the parts that he liked best were the ones that were cut. So let's pull back. What I've walked you through is admittedly a story about paperwork. Memos, contracts, shooting schedules, but that paperwork allows us to reconstruct a fairly layered account of the authorship of this sequence. We see that Hecht had a screenplay that had most of the architecture. Hitchcock conceived and directed it. Dalí created many of the settings, props, and elaborations. Then Menzies came in, reconstructed those materials as a cinematic sequence. James Bassovy supervised later art direction, and Selznick retained the final editorial authorship. So we have a lot of people who are working on that. The finished sequence was therefore not simply the work of one person. In the end, it was a Hollywood construction to which Dalí contributed substantially, albeit probably less completely than he anticipated, and less singularly than we tend to think when we say that it was designed by Salvador Dalí. But the interesting fact is not that Dalí did not design this single-handedly. It is, after all, a Hollywood film, and no one creates a dream sequence in Hollywood alone. The more consequential fact is by 1944, Dalí had become so thoroughly identified with surrealism in America that a variety of strange, unsettling images was increasingly likely to be recognized as Dalí, whether or not Dalí had made it or not. Consider the most Dalí-looking image in the sequence. The curtains covered with eyes, cut by enormous scissors. When we see that, surely we're thinking that Hecht was at least thinking about Dalí. Possibly, though maybe that's not so straightforward. To modern viewers, the eye-covered curtains immediately recall Dalí and Luis Buñuel's film Un Chien Andalou. And Dalí's eventual designs certainly intensified that association. But Hecht was working with a much broader visual vocabulary circulating in 1940s Hollywood. Freud, movie dreams, the avant-garde, film, all in addition to images already associated with surrealism and with Dalí. That image of the eyeballs has image precedence in, for example, J.J. Granville's A Dream of Crime and Punishment, a print from 1847. While the atmosphere of surveillance recalls Fritz Lang's Metropolis from 1927. It may also draw upon Freud's essay, The Uncanny, translated into English in 1925, which places violence against the eyes at the center of its analysis. American films have been drawing directly on Freud's writing since the 1920s, and elements of Freud's dream narrative, the masked proprietor, the motionless dancers, the eyeless statue that comes to life, all of that could exploit an uncertainty between the animate and inanimate that is considered in Freud's dissertation on the uncanny. We can't really know which, if any, of these sources Hecht had in mind, but it's difficult to point directly to Dalí. Still, when he's bringing out these sorts of images, we can say that Dalí did have a role in popularizing them. By 1944, there was a recognizable Dalí look that had become a form of cultural shorthand in the United States, and remains so today. That look encapsulated strange objects, distant landscapes, bodily fragments, distorted perspectives, irrational juxtapositions, all in a particular visual conception of dreams, again, whether Dalí had any direct involvement or not. That resemblance should not suggest that Dalí or even surrealism had only invented that visual vocabulary. that belonged to a much longer artistic history that Surrealism inherited and radically reconfigured through psychoanalysis, automatism, and other changes to conventional regions. But Dalí's particular achievement was to select, intensify, and recombine those until they cohered as an unusually recognizable personal style. He drew upon the shared imagery of the Surrealist movement, but also popular culture, older painting traditions, his own sophisticated reading of Freud, and through the singular force of his paintings and public personality, all that vocabulary ended up having the sort of Dalí brand name to it. This helps explain how Hollywood could produce an image that today looks so Dalínian to us that he didn't actually have anything to do with for at least a month and a half. We can actually see that process very explicitly in Spellbound. The proprietor of the gambling hall is described in the screenplay only as masked. Dalí enclosed his entire head in cloth, and that visually recalls works by Magritte and Man Ray, so not necessarily something that he came up with, actually borrowing from a Surrealist vocabulary. The furniture supported by mannequin legs echoed objects exhibited in the 1938 International Exhibition of Surrealism, including Kurt Seligman's Ultra Furniture. And the eye-bearing metronome is a very clear example, directly invoking Man Ray's Object to be Destroyed from 1923. This is not to diminish Dalí's achievement to say that he had a particular kind of authorship that synthesizes as much as it invents, and a particular kind of fame, one powerful enough to transform the shared imagery of a movement into the apparent signature of a single artist. To chart in detail how that conflation occurred would be a whole other talk, but suffice to say that it wasn't spontaneously in 1944. For more than a decade, American galleries, museums, magazines, department stores, and advertisers had been teaching audiences in the US what Dalí, and by extension, what Surrealism was supposed to look like. During the years surrounding Spellbound, international Surrealism was very much alive. The movement organized big exhibitions in Mexico City and New York, maintained its own political and intellectual debates, and would soon reassert itself in post-war Paris. Surrealism as an organized movement did not depend on Dalí. Indeed, Breton's circle had effectively expelled him years earlier. Yet in the American popular imagination, Dalí increasingly came to stand for a movement that was far more diverse, international, and politically contested than his public image suggested. Now, many accounts will blame Dalí personally for reducing Surrealism's revolution to a repertoire of drooping watches. But as Sandra Zalman has shown, that transformation can't really be attributed to Dalí alone. His American dealer, Julian Levy, deliberately sought to translate Surrealism for what he called a new audience, and other galleries in the US promoted that interpretation. Levy foregrounded dreams, mysteries, visual strangeness, and downplayed the movement's more transgressive elements and politics. From this quote here, he later explained that an orthodox, quote, manifesto-heavy version of Surrealism would have collapsed under its own rigidity, and he wanted to present a paraphrase of Surrealism, which would be more popular and more acceptable in the New World. The MoMA further institutionalized that reframing when it acquired the Persistence of Memory in 1934, and presented the painting simply as dreamlike and poetic. Magazines, exhibitions, advertisements, commercial commitments, all of these things extended that process, and of course, Dalí participated enthusiastically. All this amplified his visibility, gradually attaching the visual vocabulary of a very diverse international movement to one spectacular personality. Now, from one perspective, Spellbound represents precisely the commercialization of Surrealism that André Breton condemned when he rearranged Dalí's name into the anagram of Vita dollars. The film turns both psychoanalysis and Surrealism into accessible, popular entertainments. But that simplification was also a big source of the film's cultural power. Spellbound's paraphrase of Freudian concepts, illustrated by surrealist dream images, could reach a mass audience on a scale unavailable to exhibitions, manifestos, or specialist journals. By 1947, Spellbound had grossed more than $6 million and received 6 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. The revised chronology allows us to say more confidently than before that Hollywood had developed the essential Dalí dream before Dalí made his documented contributions. Those ideas matter enormously to people like me as art historians, but they mattered far less to the audiences who saw the film read its publicity, and remembered that dream. Dalí's name absorbed the collaborative work of Hecht, Menzies, Bassevi, even Hitchcock, and many others who helped construct the dream. By the end, it became Dalí's dream sequence. It really shows how popular and important Dalí had become and how he had absorbed many of these ideas, and how when we're walking through and when we're seeing the dream sequence, it is based on images by Salvador Dalí, but is also ultimately Dalí's dream. And now, more than 80 years later, we remain extraordinarily spellbound. Thank you very much.
Hi, we have a microphone here. If you have any questions, we can have them answered. And it is streaming to our YouTube channel, so please use the microphone. You can raise your hand if you have a question. Any questions?
Welcome questions about anything.
So the impression I'm getting is that Dalí had a lot of mixed feelings about the movie activities he was involved in. And I'm curious, do you think there's like one film that he did that he was most happy with? Because it sounds like it might not be this one.
Yeah, so the question I think that everyone heard is that he worked on a lot of films. I have a book from 2007, Dalí's Surrealism in Cinema, that's basically a chronicle of failed projects, if you think about it, because he wrote so many scripts, he tried so hard, and they all sort of failed in one way or another, which is he kept trying and they kept falling apart. The one, if I actually had to point to one offhand that he was probably happiest with, was Impressions of Upper Mongolia, which is a film from 1974, directed by Jose Montes Bacher. And I would say that because he had the biggest role in it. It's not a cohesive narrative, and I think that that's where Amanda Lear told me that Dalí was a great ideas guy. But the problem is when you make a film, you have to have a practicality. You have to plan lighting, you have to film it, you have to direct, and that wasn't really his wheelhouse, right? I mean, he had great ideas, but he really needed somebody to bring that to the screen, whether that was Luis Buñuel, Hitchcock, Disney, somebody else. I think that the Montes Bacher offhand was probably the closest we have to something that he liked and would, but actually kind of goes to fruition, which is ironic because it's one of his lesser known films. Shenandoah, I imagine he was probably pretty happy with on Shenandoah, but the problem there is we don't know at this point what parts were Dalí, what parts were Buñuel. They really considered it such a close collaboration that they weren't trying to parse that out. So probably on Shenandoah as well, he was pretty proud of. But until then, we don't get really anything until the 70s, which is pretty remarkable, given that we have literally tens, maybe even, almost 24 scripts that he wrote that never actually made it. Sure.
This is rather down a rabbit hole, but it was produced, you said, in 1947. That's post-World War II, and the GIs had come back from a horrific war.
Yes.
What do you think vibrated so with the dream sequence with the population of the United States at that point?
That's a really wonderful question. So Spellbound was actually released in 1945, but still, what you're describing there is absolutely true, and that was something that Hitchcock was really sensitive to, because you did have American servicemen coming back from the war with trauma, describing the war. The psychological community in the U.S., I think, was acutely aware of thinking about trauma and other psychological conditions. So although Spellbound wasn't actually the first film to bring psychoanalysis in, I think it was happening at a time where a greater population was aware of it and thinking about, okay, well, how does the mind work? What kinds of memories are being stored or repressed? What kind of trauma does one have? So I absolutely think that Spellbound is I don't know if the symptom is the right word, but it's a manifestation of that particular time in the United States because of the war period, absolutely. More so, I think, than something like Disney later on. And in fact, maybe that's something that is kind of one of the reasons perhaps that the Disney film Destino didn't fly when it was being worked on, is that perhaps it was too fantastical at a time when there were really some serious things going on in the United States that didn't seem perhaps like it reflected well, but that's just speculation.
I have two questions, one here, and then the person in the middle, please.
Thanks, Elliot. That was so interesting. This reminds me so much of what he did in 1939 for the Dream of Venus Pavilion, which obviously was another really contested project, where he famously wrote the Declaration of the Rights to the Artist. You know, it's a long title, but essentially, kind of defending a very traditional sense of authorship, one might say, while at the same time in the dry chamber, which he considered his manifesto, almost he was his favorite chamber. He really sourced a lot of identifiable artworks like Rene Magritte and Oscar Dominguez and many more. And I'm just wondering, given that the way his practice was so synthetic, truly, opened up to a whole new way of working that artists sort of took up in the next generation. It's almost like I find it fascinating and interesting. I just can't tell how conscious he was of it. And I wonder if you have any ideas about that.
How much was a deliberate choice to,
he had a lot of anxiety about it obviously.
No, that's a really interesting thought, and it's hard to know the ethics that he was feeling, but you're absolutely right in terms of the Dream of Venus Pavilion. I had a paragraph about Dream of Venus that I ended up cutting for time, but I thought that same thing, that this is so close to the Dream of Venus, because just as in Spellbound, he was borrowing, as you say, from Magritte, from Oscar Dominguez, and that was originally planned to be a surrealist pavilion. And then Levy and others decided we don't really need all the other surrealists if we have Dalí. So once again, his name is enough to sort of go over all of these others. Now, I don't know if he was consciously taking from their work. He was, of course. He was consciously taking it. I don't know if he felt like he was stealing it, if he felt like he had the ability to sort of manufacture a surrealist look because he was the one who was there. He didn't give credit, certainly. But it's an interesting thing to think that it's sort of I think that the way that I described it was inventing, but also synthesizing. So taking some of those ideas, but presenting them in a new way. So he presented the Magritte painting as a three-dimensional object, for example, or the way that he arranged some of those objects were still uniquely Dalínian, even if he was taking it into something else. So yeah, I don't know I don't have any evidence that he felt bad about it or guilty about it. I think he felt probably that he had the right to do it because he was there. And probably in this case too, that he went into dream sequence, and so he'd seen some of these images. Now they were part of his psyche. They were part of the circulating psyche of what dreams look like. And so sort of like, why not? I'll just, if you wanted to do there are a lot of later surrealists who do images of bowler hats, and it's always sort of like, well, that looks an awful lot like Magritte. But are they stealing Magritte, or is that now just part of the conversation that you have a bowler hat and now everybody thinks about Magritte? And so now nobody can have bowler hat anymore. So yeah, it's an interesting sort of which came first and how do you resolve that paradox? I don't have a good answer to it, but it's a really interesting thought. I think that he knew what he was doing, I guess. I think he was very aware that he was synthesizing that. I don't know if he felt he just had the right to do it, but I don't feel like he had any real ethical qualms with doing it.
Great. Last question.
Great to finally meet you, Elliot. Back in the 40s, Dalí was going to do Destino with Disney. Disney decided it wasn't quite what viewers would probably want to see, but it was nominated. It was made later and nominated for an Academy Award, as was Spellbound. Mm-hmm. Had Dalí been able to produce, and I can't get internet in here, and I always screw up the name of it, but the marks.
Giraffes on Horseback Salad.
Thank you. If he had been able to do that, how do you think that would have been received? And I know it's a very hypothetical question, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, it is a very hypothetical question. It would have been a very strange film, and some of those have been made. They've been. I know Babuo has been remade. That was the film that he did in 32 that had some really fantastic visuals that wouldn't have been really possible in 1932, but now with CGI and everything, we can make that. An animated film is a lot easier because you can draw things. And so, yeah, Giraffes on Horseback Salad, it would have been, I don't think it would have signaled as a Marx Brothers film. And that's probably why the Marx Brothers didn't want to do it. It would have been sort of a Dalí film that the Marx Brothers were in. And I think that that sort of speaks to what I'm thinking about with Spellbound here, that no matter how many people are involved, Dalí had such a notoriety and a fame that it's sort of masked what everybody else might have contributed to it. So even if you have somebody as famous as Hitchcock, or you have somebody as famous as the Marx Brothers, they become characters in the whole thing. And now we would look back on it and say, like, oh, it looks like a very Dalí film. But how it would have been received, I mean, it would have been extreme. I'm surprised, honestly, that Spellbound is as well received as it was at that time, that it got the Academy Award nominations and everything else, because it was, to my mind, looking back on it now, it's a very strange film. But Destino did get that Academy Award nomination. It would have been very interesting to see what it would have looked like had Dalí worked on it, more directly, had more time with it. If you all watch it, there's one scene, I don't know if you know this, but there's one scene where these two creatures sort of come together and they create a baseball, and there's a dancer there. That's the one scene that Dalí saw when he was actually directly working on it. And if you're watching the film now, that little scene has a different feel to it. It's darker. There's something like the drapes are hanging and they swing a little bit eerie. That one scene looks remarkably different from the rest of the film. And I used to think, well, I'm not sure how much of this really follows. I was able to read through the original storyboards that Dalí created, and I think actually the film does follow that closer than I might have expected. But what it would have ended up looking like is actually probably very different than how it would have looked if Dalí had actually stayed on and they'd actually produced it in 1948. But when you watch it, you'll notice that little thing now that I've pointed it out to you. It does have a slightly more macabre moment, and that would have looked very strange for a Disney film at the time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much.